Okay, so if you're looking on the screen, you'll see John Brown. John Brown was a terrorist, and of course that word has great resonance in the world that we live in today. But he was a terrorist on the side of abolition. He was a terrorist on the side of freedom. Very complex figure. It's hard to fully embrace him, but you can't fully reject him either. And when I talk about how the Northern white public was getting radicalized after, let's say, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, well, John Brown was someone that got really radicalized because he's killing people, especially pro-slavery proponents. And so let's talk about John Brown for a second, because his actions in the late 1850s are another step I think you've gotten the idea by now that during the 1850s, the tensions between the North and the South are growing very, very intensely. On top of it, there's a depression in 1857. There's economic issues as well. It's just a very, very troubled time. And of course, it's going to lead to a war that kills over 700,000 Americans, males, which is, it was, I guess, the storm before the storm. So let's talk about John Brown. So John Brown was someone, and you can if you're looking at this picture, he's kind of like an Old Testament figure. He was radically anti-slavery. He was radically anti-slavery. He's one of those Northerners. He has like 9 kids or something like that. But I'll talk about why that's important in a second. He had gone to Kansas after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and he was one of the folks that went into Kansas to fight those trying to plant slavery in Kansas. He was supported by a group of Bostonians who were paying for immigrants who were anti-slavery to go into Kansas. And John Brown was among those that was paid to go to Kansas, but he was very happy to do it because he was violently anti-slavery. And unlike Lincoln, who was a gradualist, John Brown wanted slavery ended yesterday. And he was willing to use violence to end slavery. So in Kansas, he gains notoriety. He comes in. He's part of the fighting between pro and anti-slavery forces in Kansas. And at a place called Potawatomi, he actually massacres some farmers who were pro-slavery farmers. He drags them out of their house and he hacks them to death. I think it's about 6 or something like that. So yeah, John Brown played for keeps. And after the Potawatomi massacre, things got a little hot in Kansas, even for John Brown. And he left Kansas, and then he comes up with a plan. He wants to go into Virginia, the western part of Virginia, and he's going to establish a base in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and he's going to launch a slave revolt in this part of Virginia. He's going to help runaway slaves, and he's going to launch attacks on slaveholders from the western part of Virginia, which is West Virginia today. At this point in the late 1850s, what's now West Virginia is still part of the state of Virginia. And he gained the support of some Bostonians, what was called the Secret Six, who had backed him all along. And it took a while for him to get this plan together. But in 1859, just a year before Abraham Lincoln's election, he rented a farm in Maryland across the river from Harper's Ferry, Virginia. In Harper's Ferry, Virginia, it's in West Virginia. It has a beautiful area, very dramatic, very high cliffs there if you've ever been there. And there was a federal arsenal there, and a federal arsenal is where the government kept guns. And so Brown rents a farm near this federal arsenal, and he waits for his army to arrive. And what he's done is his game plan is to break into the arsenal, and by doing that, he would steal the weaponry that existed in the arsenal, and then he would start handing the weaponry to some of his white allies, including his children, but also to slaves as well, so that they could launch a war, a slave insurrection against their white masters. He's taken a page, I guess, from the Nat Turner rebellion in the 1830s, although there were no whites involved in the Nat Turner rebellion in the 1830s. African Americans are very dubious about John Brown's proposal. John Brown actually meets with Frederick Douglass in August of 1859. And he tells Douglass that he's going to capture the Harper's Ferry. He originally was going to launch guerrilla actions in the South, but he had decided instead to capture the arsenal, to capture the weapons, and to start distributing the weapons to slaves and his allies his white allies that were going to fight slavery, and that they were going to launch this revolution against slavery from Harper's Ferry. Harper thought John Brown was nuts. He thought this was a terrible mistake. The attack on Harper's Ferry is an attack on the federal government. And Douglass knew that the full weight of the federal government was going to come down on John Brown if he did this. And he said, Douglass said to John Brown, "You're walking into a perfect steel trap, and you will never get out alive. And you'll never get out alive." So he warns Brown that this can't work, this plan to capture the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. But Brown, being Brown, ignores Douglass. In October 59, Douglass sets out for Harper's Ferry with 21 men, 5 African Americans, one of whom was a man by the name of Dangerfield Newby, who was hoping to rescue his wife, who was still a slave, and 16 whites, some of which were Brown's children, their sons. So they attack Harper's Ferry. They capture the rifles works, and then they round up 60 hostages. But then what happens is the revolt completely fizzles. No slaves come forth to receive the guns that Brown has captured. Slaves smell, it seems, they just know that this isn't going to work. This plan isn't going to work. And so no slaves come forward to become part of this revolt, because clearly the slaves in this area knew that it was doomed. It was a doomed cause. Brown is pinned down. Ultimately, U.S. Marines under the command of Robert E. Lee capture Brown. Robert E. Lee was in the Army, but he was in Virginia doing some personal business at this time. And he actually had been stationed in Texas, but he was in the Army settling his father-in-law's estate. And he was given command of the Marines, and they captured John Brown. They killed some of the 21 that were holed up with him. They saved the hostages. And so John Brown is captured. Ultimately, 10 of John Brown's men were killed, including both of his sons and 2 of the African Americans that were part of this rebellion. And then Brown, who was seriously wounded, was taken to Charlestown, Virginia, which is now Charleston, West Virginia, which is where the University of West Virginia is, I think. And there's a trial held. And the South was very proud that instead of just lynching John Brown, that there was going to be a trial held. Like the old joke goes, they were going to give John Brown a fair trial and then hang him, right? No one doubted what the results of this trial would be. And John Brown had killed some people in this rebellion. Now, it's at this point that John Brown becomes a martyr to Northerners. A lot of Northerners just thought John Brown was too much. He is a terrorist. He does use violence. He had massacred innocent men in Kansas. They were pro-slavery. They owned slaves, but they were innocent otherwise. So he did have blood on his hands. So a lot of Northerners looked at askance at John Brown, but he does something really brilliant in the gap between his capture and the trial. He manipulates the press. There are a lot of reporters that come visit John Brown. And John Brown, what he says is, look, I'm a Christ-like figure. Like Christ, I will die. And I will die in service to this cause. And the cause that I'm going to die for is ending slavery. And I welcome my death. I welcome my execution. And so this is a period in American life, deeply religious. Most Americans that could read had, virtually all Americans that could read had read the Old Testament. And John Brown certainly gives off an Old Testament vibe. And so he uses, like I say, he uses the couple of months between his capture and his trial to create a newspaper campaign and to kind of rebrand himself as a nut into a martyr against slavery. This is one of his quotes. He says, "If it's deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded, and that slaves are held in a wicked, cruel, and unjust position, I say, let it be done." Ralph Waldo Emerson, the transcendentalist, the philosopher who lived outside of Boston, he was the one that had said very prophetically after the Mexican War that Mexico will poison us, and he was right. He said of Brown, Brown was a new saint who will make the gallows glorious like the cross. So Brown manages to rebrand himself from a terrorist into a Christ-like figure who dies for the sins of abolitionist America, who dies in the cause of abolitionism. And of course, Southerners were just horrified that Northerners would embrace John Brown. John Brown was their worst nightmare. You know, Southerners live in terror of a slave rebellion, ever since the Haitian Rebellion. And then, this was reinforced by the Nat Turner Rebellion. And so Southerners, they look at how Brown is being regarded sympathetically in the North, and it's just like, oh my God, this is unbelievable. What will Northerners stoop to next? So yet again, right on the eve of the 1860 election, we're seeing yet another point of tension between slaveholders and those that oppose slavery, more specifically, those that oppose the expansion of slavery into new territories, but also those, of course, abolitionists that oppose slavery itself.